Today's episode is powered by Lightyear, the investment platform offering stocks and shares ISA with zero order fees. Welcome to Many Happy Returns, where we aim to make you a better investor. I'm Roman.
And I'm Michael.
Speculation is swirling about what tax changes the Chancellor might unveil in the autumn budget. But with the announcement still more than 2 months away, is it worth paying attention to the rumours?
We dig into the policy measures making headlines and ask what, if anything, should you be doing now? And in today's dumb question of the week, why are UK borrowing costs rising if interest rates are falling? All right, let's get into it. So Roman, it's that time of year again. We're in the run-up to the autumn budget and speculation is running wild. What's the government going to do? It looks like there's going to be another black hole that needs to be filled, and that probably means tax rises. Now, the media's been filled with speculation over the last few weeks. What's caught your eye so far?
I think what worries me most is that there's a shift in policy, at least in what's been leaked so far, from taxing income to taxing wealth. And that's going to be, firstly, immensely unpopular. And secondly, it's going to affect investment, almost certainly, if that's the route they decide to go down.
So I think that's true in the sense that the government's boxed themselves in by its promises in some sense. They promised not to raise the rates of income tax or national insurance or VAT or corporation tax, which accounts for a huge proportion of the tax take, those four taxes together, which doesn't leave a lot to go after. But I'm not sure how unpopular it will necessarily be with the average voter to go after wealth rather than income. Most people don't have that much wealth.
Yeah, well, I'm always thinking about my customers, and they tend to be the ones which are most wealthy. And let's face it, the people who listen to this podcast will largely be the 1%ers.
Or the people who want to be 1%ers.
Well, that's a big crowd as well, hopefully. But I've just been on holiday in Copenhagen, and it was interesting. I went out on the streets one day, and I just noticed something was very different from London. And I realised it was beggars. There weren't any beggars on the street. And I think one of the huge differences between Scandinavian countries and the UK and other Western countries is this huge wealth disparity that we have in the UK. When it comes to income, there's not such a large disparity. But when it comes to wealth, it's huge. A lot of it's concentrated in the southeast. It tends to be older people as well. But there's huge disparity. And I think that leads to all sorts of societal problems. So, maybe it's worthwhile taxing wealth and addressing that difference in distribution. But I always get the feeling that when the government tries to do that, there's a huge pushback. And then there's going to be a change of government.
I mean, the government's in a tough position, right? Because all of this stuff was going to be unpopular. No one wants to pay more tax. But they also can't really cut spending because of the coalition that makes up the party. Like, they couldn't even pass the bill about means testing the winter fuel allowance, which is such a trivial part of spending, really. But people get vocal. And if we go back to our psychology around prospect theory, we know that people hate losses far more than they love gains. And taking something away from people feels like a big loss.
But look, I agree with you that they will be unlikely to try and cut spending by a lot. But something's going to have to give. They're going to have to plug the gap if they don't want to raise more debt.
I think the market's acutely aware of the danger that Labour might abandon its fiscal rules and is ready to punish them if they were to do that, I think.
And the UK has been very good relative to other countries. The US has been running a fiscal deficit for a long time, and the UK is actually being quite strict about it. But one of the prices that you pay for that is that we can't stimulate our economy as much as another country like the US, say.
So in terms of plugging the gap, there's one asset class which seems to be making headlines more than any other, and that's property. Now, I think we can probably all agree that the way that the UK taxes property currently is absurd. We have stamp duty on transactions, which any economist is going to tell you is inefficient. It discourages people from moving. It gums up the labour market because people don't want to go to where the jobs are because you've got to find money to pay this tax if you want to move house. We've also got council tax, but that's sort of frozen in time like a fossil from the early 90s and is kind of regressive because it caps out at a certain level and the biggest properties pay far less as a proportion of the asset than smaller houses. But it's an extremely difficult system to change because people love their houses and they don't love paying tax on them. We've got a bit of Stockholm syndrome, to go back to your Scandinavian point.
And again, this is an emotive issue. I think there'll be a huge pushback if there is some kind of really radical new policy on how property is taxed. I speak to quite a few people who have buy-to-let properties who are now pulling out of the market because they say all of the laws are now seemingly going against them. And that's had repercussions. If you look at the ability of people to get rental property, a lot of those properties have come off the market. So all of this is going to have consequences, and a lot of them will be unforeseen consequences because it's going to be a huge shake-up, and no government can fully foresee what the consequences of their actions will be.
So shall we run through some of the potential policies around property that have been in the press over the last couple of weeks? So maybe the biggest one would be changing the way capital gains tax works, because at the moment people don't pay that on their primary property, their home, but there's this thought that, well, if the home's over a certain value, up into the millions, maybe people should be taxed on the gain when they sell it. Obviously, it would affect very few people, but they'd be very vocal about how that's a bad change. And if you think stamp duty's bad, that's kind of playing in the same ballpark. Similarly, there's also been talk that maybe you could apply a levy to sales over a certain amount, and maybe you change the way stamp duty works so it's not paid by the buyer, it's paid by the seller. But then an economist would say that probably doesn't make a huge difference. It's going to be factored into the price either way. And you would get a lot of very strange transition effects where people have just bought a house, paid the stamp duty, and now they want to sell it. And they feel, well, we're going to have to pay stamp duty again as the seller. So to me, that seems unlikely unless they sort of introduce loads of complexity for those edge cases. Now, another big question is, what are they going to do with council tax? This is maybe the most sensitive tax in the UK. There's the history with the poll tax. It's all sort of tied up in that. That's why values have been frozen since the early 90s. And council tax is also strange. So it's collected at the local level and it pays for things that you might not think. People always think about bin collections and libraries and local services, but it actually funds a lot of social care, which is strange, right? Why would we fund social care from a local property levy?
Yeah, Laura worked for the council and she always talks about special educational needs because people don't realise what proportion of the council's income goes towards funding that service.
So if they are going to reform council tax, I imagine it would be done bit by bit. I've seen talk that, okay, maybe they just target the top 2 bands of council tax and turn that into a more sort of ongoing levy based on the property's value, which is more like what you get in the US, right? Where property taxes are a much bigger proportion of the asset value and you pay them every year. It's not this hybrid of stamp duty and council tax that we have.
So expect torches and pitchforks to start arriving from the home counties the minute they announce that.
Yeah, I just struggle to see how they can get this through Parliament, right? If you couldn't get through the winter fuel thing, try overhauling property taxes. You need a massive majority, which I guess they have, but you need a unified party and the ability to stand up to the right-wing press and get the reforms right. Like, just because you change something doesn't necessarily make it better.
But this is something that's been discussed for so long. I remember even as a child, there was talk about taxing very expensive houses.
Yeah, it comes up every so often, doesn't it? Was it under the coalition we had talk of the mansion tax, which never actually came in?
Yeah, because of the unpopularity. Plus, remember, lots of people in Parliament, particularly in the House of Lords, own mansions. So they're not going to be particularly keen on that tax.
Yeah, there's a lot of weird incentives at play within Parliament itself. I mean, we've just had the sort of absurd situation where the housing secretary had to resign because she couldn't work out how to purchase a house properly and pay the right tax, which is just the state of British politics, isn't it?
Now, I mentioned the person who was talking about his buy-to-let property and selling it. Now, a big reason behind that for him was that national insurance might start being charged on rental income. And you can kind of see the logic behind it. If this is going to provide you with an income, then there are people who live solely based on this buy-to-let income, and yet they don't pay any kind of national insurance.
Again, it's one of those historical accidents about how our tax code is built up, that we have 2 kinds of income tax effectively, income tax itself and national insurance. Originally, there was a kind of link between national insurance and pensions or the NHS, but that's not really there now. And you can certainly make the case that it's weird that we charge national insurance on some types of income, but not others. But then, if you're a landlord, you'd probably say, well, rental income is a kind of investment income, and we don't charge national insurance on investment income, at least not yet. But if I had to pick a change which I thought was most likely from this property stuff, national insurance on rental income is probably likely to provoke less of a public backlash than changing council tax and stamp duty. What do you think?
Personally, I think the council tax revaluation is the most likely one because everyone recognises that it's a crazy system. Why would you base it on where property prices were 30 years ago? That makes no sense at all. So I think that might be the one which generates more revenue and may not get as much pushback. Whatever you do is going to get some pushback, but I think that might be the one that's most likely.
Can I tell you why I think that's not the most likely one? It's because if the government has a black hole it needs to fill that now, at least within the 5-year forecast window, right, to please the Office for Budget Responsibility. Now, if you're going to change the council tax bands radically, you're going to have to revalue millions of properties, right? It's not just a button on a computer like it is with charging national insurance on rental payments. You've actually got to go and assess and say, what is that house worth today? Which band is it going to fall in, or however you do it? And then you've probably got to institute an appeals process and phase it in. Like, I don't think you'd raise much revenue to plug any black holes with a massive council tax reform.
Yeah, maybe they'll be clever about it and they'll use actual sold property prices and then use some kind of regression model to say your house is like that one that was sold recently, so its price is probably this. But there again, maybe they won't.
Now, another big area where tax reform is constantly proposed and actually instituted is around pensions. Maybe the biggest recent change has been ending the loophole where defined contribution pensions did not form part of an estate and therefore were not subject to inheritance tax. That is changing in the coming years. But there's all sorts of speculation now about other ways the government could change how pensions work and how taxes on pensions work.
Now, the wild card here is Torsten Bell, who's now an MP. Previously, he was head of the Resolution Foundation, and he's been asked to contribute towards his budget. So I think a lot of people are worried about some of the statements he's made in the past, particularly on pensions. And I'd say the most controversial of those was about flat rate pension tax relief on contributions. So at the moment, it seems simple on the face of it because the relief you get is on your marginal rate. So if you pay 20% basic rate tax, that's the relief you get. If you pay additional rate tax, you get the 45% relief. Now that does mean that people who earn more get a larger relief, but they also contribute more. Whereas if you had a flat rate, then it wouldn't benefit those people at the top of the income scale as much as it would benefit the people on the lower income scale.
I mean, conceivably, it would not benefit people at the top of the income scale at all, and it would not be rational for them to put money in a pension. Let's say the flat rate of relief was set to 25%. Good news if you're a 20% taxpayer, free money if you contribute because you're getting more relief than your marginal tax rate. But if you're a 40% taxpayer or 45% rate taxpayer, and crucially, you expect to still be paying 40% income tax in retirement, why would you put money in your pension to only get 25% relief?
Yeah, this would fall into the unintended consequences bucket, because what's likely to happen is these higher income people are likely to shift their money into ISAs rather than SIPs. Now, there's a very limited contribution you can make in ISAs, but I think that would be one of the consequences.
I mean, personally, I just think the correct and default way we should be approaching tax relief for pensions is relief at the marginal rate on the way in and tax at the marginal rate on the way out. That seems to be the fair way of doing it. People, I think, don't quite understand how tax reliefs work. So they think, well, it's unfair to give 40% relief to one and 20% to the other. But that's just what you have to do to make the incentives right, I think. Anyway, we'll see what they do there. The other rumours are around the tax-free lump sum.
Now, if you're not familiar with the idea, if you retire, you can take 25% of the value of your pot tax-free. You can either take that as a single lump sum, or you can space it out into multiple payments called UFPLUS, Uncrystallised Funds Pension Lump Sum. So think of that as taking lots of mini lump sums, of which 25% is tax-free. But many people have pointed out, including myself, that that might be more tax efficient than taking it all on day one. However, what I hear from many people at the moment, and actually in the previous budget, was people were worried that that was going to be taken away or massively reduced from 25% to potentially zero.
And so people have acted on that speculation and have been withdrawing more in upfront lump sums. In fact, data from the Financial Conduct Authority suggests tax-free lump sums have risen more than 60% over the past financial year. So people aren't hanging around, are they? I think they don't trust the government not to tinker with this. Because at the moment in legislation, the maximum tax-free lump sum you can take from your pension is £268,275. You could easily see that cap shrinking over time, even if it's still 25% of the pot you get relief on. It's just if you have a really big pot, the cap's lower than 25%.
And just to get a feeling of what Torsten Bell feels about this lump sum, he published a report in 2019 when he was at the Resolution Foundation, and he described the lump sum allowance as very generous, very regressive, and a strange incentive not to stagger your retirement income. So what he suggested is a cap of 40,000.
That would seem low. I can't see them dropping it to 40,000 in one go. Like, I don't disagree with his points, like in the abstract. It is obviously generous that you can get 25% of over £1 million tax-free. It is obviously regressive because that's a huge amount of money. In terms of a disincentive to stagger, well, I don't know about that. Like you say, you can stagger it and take the 25% as you go. The reason there's a disincentive to stagger and people are rushing to get money out is because they think it might change.
That's right. But he thinks it would raise £2 billion a year. And it would also leave 3/4 of future pensioners unaffected because the size of investment pots are just not that large.
This is one of the things I could see getting massive pushback, though, because a lot of people have sort of earmarked that 25% lump sum for settling the balance on a mortgage or using it in some other way. It's like it's in their financial plan. And if you pull the rug from under them at the last minute, well, that's the kind of thing that riles people up.
Oh, yeah. If you've already penciled that in because of a house renovation or gifts to the kids, you're going to be very angry.
And I think it's also one of these things where the government might think it's a stealth tax because it's not income tax, national insurance, VAT or whatever. But I don't think so. It's very salient. This 25% lump sum is understood by a lot of people. What I think might be more likely is freezing the cap on the tax-free lump sum in nominal terms and letting inflation do its work and fiscally dragging it to effectively lower it in real terms over time.
Yeah, but in terms of their goal of getting more income, I think that's not going to help much because there just aren't that many people with that amount of money in their pension, I don't think.
Yeah, to raise a lot of money, you'd have to drop the cap quickly and substantially.
And sticking with the theme of anger, I think another one which is very incendiary is inheritance tax. Now, there's talk about capping lifetime gifts. At the moment, the situation in the UK is if I hand over money to my kids, say, as long as I survive for 7 years, that gets tapered down to 0, the inheritance tax on it. So there is talk about capping that over an entire lifetime.
And I believe there is a cap in the US. I'm not an expert on the US tax code. I'm not even an expert on the UK tax code. But I think in the US, they have a cap. It's something crazy like $10 million. But if you're paying huge fees for your kids' schools and universities and all that stuff, it gets bundled in. The thing with inheritance tax in the UK is if you're well advised and plan well in advance, it's kind of an optional tax. Like if you gift the money early in your life and survive for more than 7 years, as you say, you can use that to manage the value of your estate quite effectively. Now, there are caveats on it. Like if you give your house to your kids, but keep on living in it yourself and not paying rent to them, and they're not paying income tax on the rent, HMRC will say, well, that's not actually a gift. And they will treat that as part of the estate. This is called a gift with reservation of benefit.
But I've now realised as a kind of aging parent that if I do hand over money to my kids, I'm going to have to make a record of it because when I die, there's going to be potentially a tax complication.
What, you plan to die within the next 7 years?
Not well, I never planned to do it, but you never know. Like my grandmother always used to say, you have to keep your bags packed.
But it's a fair point. Like if they were to cap lifetime gifts, that's a hell of a lot of record keeping. And if it was retroactive, well, people haven't got records going back the last 50 years of every gift they've made.
And in fact, some people take the tax-free lump sum in order to gift that to their children. Maybe they've got too much in their pension or more than they need, they think. So why not use it for gifting? There's a fairly good chance just as you retire that you're going to survive 7 years, whereas later on it might be a bit more iffy.
You know what I could see them doing if they were desperate to change this? Is forget that lifetime cap stuff. That's just too hard to bring in. Look at this 7-year rule. What if they said, well, every year it goes up one? So it's 7 years at the moment. Next year's is the 8-year rule. Then it's the 9-year rule. Then the 10-year rule. And you kind of get to a lifetime gift cap bit by bit, slowly, and grandfather in all the boomers. So they've gifted for free over the years. It's kind of like that smoking thing where there's the proposal, isn't there, that people who are like 15 now, it will never be legal for them to smoke in some countries because they add a year every time.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, you're always kind of trading off complexity here against something which generates cash today. And anything which they gradually bring in is probably not going to survive this government anyway.
I think they are willing to take a political hit to reform inheritance tax. We saw that with the farmers, right? Where farmland went from being completely tax-free on death to being taxed at a 20% rate with a really generous allowance, which is obviously less than the 40% rate. But obviously, farmers aren't happy to go from 0 to 20%.
And they didn't cave on that one like they did on other taxes. So maybe this will be the one. Today's episode is sponsored by Lightyear, the investment app built for a great user experience available on both web and mobile. They've just made their stocks and shares ISA completely commission-free, so you can invest in over 6,000 stocks and ETFs without trading fees eating into your returns. Fund manager fees and a 0.35% FX fee may still apply. You can also transfer your ISA in or out at any time, giving you extra flexibility to manage your money the way you want. You can try Lightyear using the code PensionCraft or follow the link in the description to get up to $115 worth of a US fractional share in your general investment account. Terms and conditions apply. See the description for details. Remember that investing involves risk, and the value of your investments can go down as well as up. Now, one of the things close to my heart, obviously, is investing and taxes around investing. And there is talk about having higher capital gains tax, maybe making it in line with income tax. At the moment, of course, it is more generous.
Certainly something that the Labour base has been pushing for. There's this instinctive feeling that, well, why are returns on capital taxed lower than returns on earned income, people going out to work? Now, if we put the economist hat on, we can tell you why that might make sense. To earn gains, you have to put capital at risk, and you've got to account for inflation. At the moment, there's no indexation allowance on UK capital gains tax, where there used to be. Then Gordon Brown dropped the index linking and lowered the rate. Now we're in the situation where the rate's been creeping up again, but an adjustment for inflation hasn't come back in. If you decided to align it with income tax, I think you'd have to bring back the indexation, or people would just be paying tax on inflation. I also think there's a question of how much would you actually raise here by bumping capital gains taxes up again, because people would just wait it out, right?
And remember, one of the goals here for the government is to get more infrastructure investment. And if you want that to happen, then people are going to have to put capital at risk. So what they don't want is a policy on tax to run counter to their policy on growth. And let's face it, the most important aspect of all of these reforms is to get more income for the government. Because if they're not going to slash spending, they have to balance the books. And a good way to do that is to increase growth, because usually the tax take is proportional to GDP.
Yeah, and higher taxes on investment returns obviously run counter to an incentive to invest. The other thing people would point out is that as well as capital gains taxes, dividend taxes are also more generous than income taxes. Maybe that's something you could see reformed.
That's certainly something that's been discussed. So if you run your own company, and many people in the UK do, then you choose to pay yourself via dividends. So if that's shut down, there'll be much less of an incentive to set up your own company, and that in turn, I think, could affect UK growth.
I think if you run your own business, there are a lot of things they could do and have been rumoured that they might do, which would affect you, especially if you're running a small business. So there's this constant talk about VAT, and specifically the threshold at which a business has to pay VAT or become VAT registered, which is, I believe, £90,000. And if you look at the data from HMRC and you plot a graph of the number of businesses and how much their annual turnover is, there's this huge bump, massive in the data, just below £90,000, like where you have to register for VAT, which obviously is extremely inefficient. What that's basically saying is businesses grow to this size and then say, well, it's a bit of a hassle, isn't it, to make more money now? Because I have to go through all this admin, so I won't bother.
The beauty of having an accountant.
But also you've got to raise your prices to account for VAT, right?
I remember I was so excited when we crossed the threshold. But it did result in us increasing our prices. I think at the time we said, if you want to have a power hour, do it now, because we're going to put up the prices when we have to pay VAT.
Yeah, this was a few years ago. I remember you doing that. And that is the incentive right here for people to stay below the VAT threshold. So there's some suggestions that the best way around this is just to dramatically lower the threshold where businesses have to pay VAT to something like £30,000 I've seen suggested. I think that would get a lot of pushback too. But you can see the economic case for it. It levels the playing field between different businesses.
Yeah, I suppose so. But I always think that you should encourage people to start up new businesses. And any kind of encouragement you can give via taxes, anything else, is a good thing. This would be a bit of a cosh, particularly in the early years when you're struggling to increase your revenue.
Also not going to help inflation, right? If all the small businesses suddenly have to put up their prices.
Because they employ a lot of people. There's also talk about increasing national insurance contributions on self-employed earnings from 2 to 8%. And also to increase that basic rate of tax on dividends from 8.75%, which is where it is now, to 20%, which would be a real blow for us as a company.
Or at least as owners of a company, drawing income from the company.
Yeah, exactly. And I think many people are in that boat.
The other thing that's been rumoured is that certain kinds of business partnerships don't have to pay national insurance contributions. And it's kind of a historical accident. That could be reformed. And there are a lot of professional services which are set up as partnerships, which you could affect. Just stepping back a bit, the weird thing with the British tax system is you look at it and there are loads of things you say, well, why is that the case? Why are we not paying national insurance on partnerships? You're like, well, it's a historical accident. It came in from some sort of royal commission back in the day or whatever. And no one's bothered to change it because it would upset too many lawyers or whatever. And now there's a sensible thing like, let's bring it into line with everything else. But like you say, there's all these unintended consequences and a short-term bump in prices or people deciding to retire early and then the supply side gets constrained. And ultimately, there's always this incentive on government to not change anything too dramatically because they don't want to face the short-term pain.
But I think we've reached a point now where there's a real crunch because revenue's got to increase. There was a gamble by Rachel Reeves on growth increasing so that she wouldn't have to do anything too radical on tax. Well, that didn't pan out. So we're going to have huge reforms, whether it's this government or the next or both. But something radical's got to happen.
I think it's not just individuals and investors who might be nervous about the budget this year. Also, businesses could be in the crosshairs. So there's been talk about raising the surcharge banks have to pay. This was obviously originally brought in after the financial crisis to recognise the unique role that banks have in the economy and the risk they have and the fact that there's a kind of implicit state guarantee behind them. But we've now been through Brexit and London as a financial centre. Its position is maybe not as secure as it used to be, so raising the bank surcharge could be a risky thing to do. Another sector which I've seen talked about is the gambling industry. Quite different from banks, obviously. But what are they talking about here, Roman?
So at the moment, we've got a multi-tier system for gambling, remote gambling. But the idea here is that there's going to be a single unified duty on gambling. Now, this could potentially be a really big earner for the UK. Some estimates put it at around £2 billion a year.
I saw that Gordon Brown's been advocating for this, like higher taxes on the gambling industry because of its social effects and because of the fact that it's been hugely profitable in recent years.
Now, one thing that always surprised me is that spread betting in the UK is usually tax-free. So there's no capital gains tax, there's no income tax to pay. And to me, that doesn't seem right.
Another industry that could be in the crosshairs is energy. There's an energy profits levy, and there's a rumour that that could go higher.
But we've already had windfall taxes on energy, haven't we?
Yeah, I think that was when energy prices spiked after Russia invaded Ukraine. And it was seen as a kind of unearned profit, right? But I think if you're heavily invested in these sectors, you probably want to keep an eye on this stuff. Which kind of brings us on to the point of, well, what should you do about all these rumours? It's clear that some people are doing things, like we said, around the pension tax-free lump sums. Far more people are pulling the lump sums out of their pension now, this year, because they fear that the rules are going to change. And also with all the speculation around tax changes on property, many estate agents are saying the market's kind of hesitant at the moment. It's drying up. People are waiting to see what's coming in November.
I remember at the previous budget, I spoke to several clients who wanted power hours, and we discussed what was happening with the budget, and they decided that they wanted to crystallise any capital gains tax because there were rumours that CGT was going to spike. And in the event, it increased from 20 to 24%. But people probably regretted that, I think. So I'd probably say take it easy. Don't panic. It's probably going to be okay. It's unlikely you'll be able to guess what they're going to do. We've seen all the huge number of possible things which are on the table. But the risk is that you do something which ultimately is going to hurt you financially and which doesn't circumvent any tax increase because the tax increase doesn't happen.
People always say, don't let the tax tail wag the investment dog, right? Which I get. And especially don't let rumoured tax changes wag the dog. But I think it's a bit more nuanced than that. Like if I was in the market for a buy-to-let property right now, and I'm looking at the rental yield I might get, and it's close to like the gilt yield or something, and I'm thinking, well, if they do start charging national insurance on my rental income, that's going to make it unprofitable or a lot less profitable. I might hold off a few months, right? What's a few months if you're going to buy something so expensive?
But like you say, this would be more of a decision to delay a transaction rather than making a radical change to an existing situation, i.e. selling all your buy-to-lets today.
I think there's a big distinction here between reversible moves and irreversible moves. If something's reversible, maybe get it in the most optimum state for what you think's going to happen. If it's irreversible, you've got to be super careful. I saw some stories about how people had transferred a defined benefit pension into a defined contribution scheme purely for the fact they wanted to be able to pass a sum on to their children, right? And it was free of inheritance tax at that point. Now that the rules have changed, what they've made is an irreversible decision. You can't go back on that. And it's going to cost them a lot of money.
Another big one, I think, is your tax-free lump sum. If you take it all today, well, the problem is that you're not going to be able to do that UF plus phased trick, which probably, if the tax law doesn't change too much, would benefit you. You pay a lot less tax over the long term as a result of that.
But then if they do change the law, you'll be laughing.
I think what they're going to do is change the law to make the UF plus approach more beneficial. So maybe it wouldn't be so detrimental if you hadn't made the change. The difficulty always with a lump sum is what you're going to do with it. If you are going to invest it, then getting it into an ISA may take many years. So that's always the difficulty, I think.
Yeah, if you start pulling things out of a tax-advantaged account into a general investment account and don't have a plan for what you're going to do with it, yeah, you would need the law to change quite drastically to make that beneficial, I think. But just to go back to that point about the example where someone transferred a defined benefit to a defined contribution scheme, government changed the law, now it didn't look so smart. They were acting on the basis of what the law was at the time. At the time, there was this loophole where you didn't pay inheritance tax on defined contribution pensions. And it was a great way to minimize those inheritance tax payments. So you could say, well, they weren't trying to second guess the law, right? They were just acting as what the law was. My view is, look at the law rationally as best you can and say, if something is too good to be true, it's probably not going to stick around. Like that was a big loophole that cost the government a lot of money. And really rationally, you couldn't make the case for it. Why would you treat these things differently to the rest of an estate when it comes to inheritance tax? So I think when it comes to these big irreversible moves, you do have to think, how could the law realistically change in the near future? People undervalue optionality when it comes to their investments.
Yeah, I think in that spirit, you've got to look at things which were introduced to get into power and to please the electorate, which don't seem as if they're going to survive tough times like we've got now when you get big structural reforms. But certain universal truths apply here. I think that it's unlikely that they're going to scrap the ISA, maybe the cash ISA, but certainly not the stocks and shares ISA. because you have to have people investing for a rainy day. Use your pension allowance. It's very unlikely they're going to scrap tax benefits on UK pensions. That would be absolutely bonkers. The principle of saving as much as you can, I think, also applies. And if you are finding yourself depending heavily on one source of revenue or wealth, like buy-to-let properties or your investment portfolio, then maybe it makes sense to diversify across multiple sources of wealth and income. That way, at least, whatever the Chancellor throws at you, you'll be able to weather it. If you want to find out what other people are doing, then you can do that as part of our community using our chat application. Or you could ask questions about potential changes in the budget as well. To learn more, just go to our website, pensioncraft.com/membership.
Okay, today's dumb question of the week. Why are UK borrowing costs rising if interest rates are falling? So if you look at what the Bank of England has been doing with its policy rate, its recent peak was 5.25%, as it was fighting inflation post-COVID. And it's been on a steady decline in recent months and is now at 4%. However, at the same time, the 30-year yield on UK government bonds has been rising quite sharply and is now at 5.5%. Can you explain this for us, Robin? Why is the cost of borrowing for the UK government going up at the same time as the Bank of England is cutting rates?
Yeah, I think an important thing to point out here is that the UK is not alone in having this curve steepening, as it's called. What that actually means is that the short-term borrowing rates are falling while long-term rates are rising. Now, as an investor, if you do buy longer-term gilts, this is good news because it means you're getting more of something called the term premium. You're being compensated more to take duration risk in the UK. But the two ends of the curve always behave very differently. Short-term maturity gilts are driven very much by monetary policy. The long end is driven by many other factors. Growth and inflation expectations, those have potentially increased, certainly on the inflation side. And in the UK, we've got certain long-term shifts, which we're seeing, which is that there are less natural buyers of this long-term debt. Defined benefit pensions in particular are slowly winding down as their members die and aren't being replaced. And those were big buyers of long-dated UK debt. Plus, in the US, people are worried about the US Treasury market because President Trump is questioning Fed independence and threatening it. And of course, the US is seemingly blasé about a deficit. So all of these factors in the US are pushing up long-term yields. We've got particular structural problems in the UK. Plus, there was a beautiful paper by my ex-boss, Larry Hathaway, recently talking about why real rates are increasing. But the gist is there's more demand for savings and less supply of savings.
I've seen that point made quite a lot recently, which is that credit spreads are tight, i.e., companies are not having to pay much more in interest than governments right now, even quite dodgy companies who are risky borrowers. And at the same time, maybe because of that, there's a flood of corporate issuance. A lot of people are on the debt markets asking for money. And in a way, that competes with government bonds. So it's like you've said, you've got a huge supply of debt and maybe fewer buyers than there were in the past, especially now that central banks have stepped back from quantitative easing.
Another big factor, according to Larry, is the trade war. And there the problem is that if you've got less trade, so let's say that the US gets less imports from China, then China has less reserves to park in the US and will buy less US treasuries. So reduced globalization and less cross-border flows is another problem and is likely to push up longer-term yields.
And to be clear, your point is that if yields in the US are rising at the long end of the curve, that affects the UK indirectly.
Yeah, we usually get dragged up by the US, even if it makes no sense.
But it seems as if investors are demanding more for UK debt, regardless of what's happening in the US, right? Is that because of inflation concerns, like you said, or concerns about the sustainability of our debt and the ability of the government to rein in spending and raise taxes?
Yeah, I think at the back of investors' minds, people always remember what Labour did in the past, which was to have a deficit, to spend more, and to spend disproportionately relative to the increase in taxes. And that fiscal deficit would be bad for the bond market.
And just to wrap up here, Is that rise in long-term yields telling us something about what the Bank of England is doing now? Because let's remember, inflation is 3.8% and they've been cutting interest rates. Are investors hinting that they're worried that the Bank of England might not get inflation under control for the long term?
Personally, I don't think it's about Bank of England credibility. I think it's more about a structural increase, a long-term increase in the level of inflation. The years of moderation which we saw may be an anomaly. We may simply have to get used to higher inflation longer term. And there are a bunch of reasons why that's specifically affecting the UK. We've restricted our own workforce with Brexit, so we can't get cheaper labour to come into the country. That's going to, at the margin, increase inflation in the UK. And some of the changes we've seen in government policy have also been inflationary, things like increasing national insurance. That, in some cases, has been passed on to consumers. But look, the central bank also has to have an eye on growth, although that isn't explicitly part of their mandate. So you can see why they might want to cut the UK policy rate in order to have some kind of stimulus for the economy. At the same time as we see this demand dry up for really long-dated UK debt.
So is the government going to start issuing debt at the shorter end of the curve now?
I don't think they've got much choice. I think if there isn't the demand, they have to adjust to that new dynamic. We'll become more like the US. Historically, we've tended to issue more long-dated debt. We may have to shift to the short end.
Thank you for joining us for Many Happy Returns. Keep sending us your questions, no matter how dumb, at mhr@pensioncraft.com.
And do remember to check out PensionCraft.com for all the information about our membership, courses, and investment coaching options.
Many Happy Returns is a PensionCraft production, co-hosted and executive produced by Roman Nakiza and Michael Pugh. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes and is not financial advice. We do not provide recommendations or endorse any decision to buy, sell, or hold any security. We cannot be held responsible for any actions listeners may take, and investors are encouraged to seek independent financial advice.